This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. Joining me today, I have Dr. Samantha Yaussy of James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I don't know if you know this, but I'm actually from Virginia, so every time,
nice.
Every time I have
so you
someone,
know the area already.
yeah. Every time I have someone on, I'm like, I got my Virginia pride. Virginia's for lovers, y'all.
Mm-hmm.
Well, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you on. You are a bioarchaeologist, and you specialize in. There's like a lot of themes to your work, and I'm super excited to talk about them because we get to talk about a lot of different topics. And I think that one of the most exciting things about anthropology in general is that you get to use so many things from so many different disciplines, which I think keeps it really fresh and exciting. I have like crow brain, and I like love looking at all the little shiny things and like putting them together in a nest of research. And that is. We're done with the metaphor. It's a bad metaphor, but you know what I mean. So I think the place that I would like to start is talking a little bit about like one of the main themes of your work, which is this idea of frailty. So you are a bioarchaeologist. So just in case this is your first episode ever, a bioarchaeologist is someone who looks at historical assemblages of human skeletons and uses the skeletons to try and figure out what life was like in the past. And one of your main focuses when you're looking at these assemblages is sussing out this idea of frailty. So I was hoping that you could describe what frailty is.
Right. So frailty is a kind of tricky concept, right? It has a few different definitions in the clinical literature. It has a few different definitions in bioarchaeology. Typically, when someone says frailty, what they're thinking of is the kind of the modern clinical definition, which is this phenotype that we typically see as someone gets to older ages, where they have reduced mobility and decreased endurance, reduced strength, greater susceptibility to illnesses and diseases, right? And so frailty kind of accumulates over your life, and modern medical professionals can diagnose that in you as you get older. And it's influenced by a variety of different genetic and biological and cultural factors, right? But in bioarchaeology, frailty has been defined or is often defined as increased risk of mortality or increased risk of death, which is also, again, influenced by a whole host of different genetic factors, hormonal factors, behavioral factors, right? And so a lot of times when bioarchaeologists are interested in studying frailty, what we'll do is we'll use age-structured data to study patterns of mortality over time. And so we'll evaluate some associations between what we can see in the skeleton and what we know about those individuals to see what factors are affecting the age at which a person dies.
So when you say age structure, do you mean you're like taking a big group of people and you're saying like, okay, for 18 to 19-year-olds or 18 to 25-year-olds, this is more realistic?
Exactly. Right. So what is the composition of that population in terms of ages? And then, what are the factors that are influencing the ages at which people are dying?
That totally makes sense. This is something that shows up. Well, no, I'm not going to get there yet. My first question is like, when you're looking at these assemblages, you've got bones. So what are you looking at to determine this idea of frailty?
So we've got a few different approaches out there. So generally, we want to search the skeleton for some of these kind of skeletal indicators of increased risk of death or increased frailty, right? So we want specific markers that we can identify that in previous studies have been connected to the likelihood of someone dying. So some of these skeletal markers are specific to one disease, right? We know it's indicative of one very specific condition that a person might have. So, for example, rickets is a condition that is caused by vitamin D deficiency. And so when you consume vitamin D throughout your life, part of what that vitamin D is doing is it is ensuring that your bones are solid, right? You don't want your bones to be squishy.
Yeah, that's why milk is always like vitamin D fortified, because it's the calcium and the vitamin D for your bones.
Exactly. And so everybody knows, calcium and vitamin D, need that for your bones. It's perfect for bone formation. If you don't get enough vitamin D, you don't have the rigidity that your bones need, and they can actually start to bend under your body weight. And so one of the features that we look for to identify rickets is bent or bowed long bones, like your femur and your tibia. Some of the other indicators we can look for are a little less specific. So for example, we have this condition known as cribro-orbitalia. And this is when there is porosity in your orbital roofs, or your
your eye sockets,
superior surfaces of your eye sockets, right? And so this porosity has been connected to a whole bunch of different medical conditions, anemia, scurvy, vitamin D deficiency, even infections, with parasites or with other diseases. So all of these different conditions could be causing cribro-orbitalia in an individual. We don't necessarily know which one it was, but we do know that if we're seeing that, that means you went through something rough. You went through a rough patch health-wise. And so we know that if we have that marker, that person was probably more frail. They probably were at increased risk of death compared to all their peers.
For cribro-orbitalia, is that something that can happen at any time in life, or is it something that has to happen like early in life to affect the bone?
So cribro-orbitalia is really interesting because it can't happen throughout life. So at least with your orbital roofs, the porosity that defines cribro-orbitalia is typically related to increased red blood cell production. And your red blood cell production depends on where you have different types of bone marrow throughout your body. And that pattern of bone marrow is dependent on your age. So only children have that specific type of bone marrow in their orbital roofs. And so you can really only develop cribro-orbitalia pretty early in your life. And once you reach, adolescence, you're going to start having a diminished ability to create that particular skeletal indicator.
Right. So then what about parodic hyperostosis?
Parodic hyperostosis is similar. There have been a lot of people who have suggested that cribro-orbitalia and parodic hyperostosis are related to each other because they look similar. We see cribro-orbitalia on the roof of your orbit. We see parodic hyperostosis as porosity across your cranial vault. So a lot of people have suggested, okay, these are just different
manifestations
of kind of the same condition, right? It just depends on where the marrow is that's causing that porosity.
And then, so parodic hyperostosis, that's something that happens like potentially later in life, because that's like, is that the idea?
So not necessarily. A lot of people suggest that parodic hyperostosis is also primarily a childhood indicator. There are other indicators we can use to maybe consider other portions of a person's life. So for example, periosteal new bone formation is this buildup of bone in response to some sort of insult, right? Your bone gets insulted just like you do. So you you inflict some sort of trauma on the bone, or maybe there's an infection on or in or near the bone, and that causes the bone to respond. I mean, it tries to protect itself, essentially. And so periosteal new bone formation is this excess buildup of bone in response to whatever that disturbance was. And these things can happen at any point during life. I mean, you think about how often you hit your shin on a coffee table. You could be causing trauma to your shin, and your bone is probably going to respond to that. And so you could have all these little bumps and bruises all across your shin that are consistent with periosteal new bone formation.
Yeah, yeah. I last year I found out that one of my eyes is pointed slightly below the other one. And so I've been walking around with my head tilted to the side for years. And my ophthalmologist was like, "Do you always hold your head like that?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "You look like a confused golden retriever." And I was like,
these are worse animals to be compared to.
I was like, I literally don't know what you're talking about. And he put a prism in my glass, and I have stopped running into coffee tables because my head is straight now.
I wish that someone would give me the fix for running into coffee tables, because I think it's just me being clumsy and just, hopeless at this point.
But no, so yeah, so there's like a whole like range of how these periosteal new bone formation can manifest. If you want a really cool visual example, if you go online and you Google osteomyelitis bone, you should get some really gnarly examples if you look in Google Images.
Really fantastic images. Yeah.
Bones are fun. So there's one of the things that I'm hearing with like the crib orbitalia and the parotid hyperostosis, rickets, these are things that are typically affecting people when they're younger. I think one of the things that we have realized as a whole is that childhood nutrition and like health have a huge impact on your adult health. I'm tying this back into the frailty. So like if someone is experiencing like a lot of childhood stress, like what does that look like in assemblages? Like what patterns are you noticing in the adult mortality rates?
Generally, we are seeing a connection between some of these skeletal indicators of stress or disease in childhood and earlier mortality. I mean, we've had several studies at this point which have connected different indicators that are associated with childhood. So shorter limb lengths, lines on your teeth, smaller vertebra, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, a lot of these different indicators that we know of throughout the skeleton that are consistent with disruptions as you develop and as you grow. And they all have been connected to people dying at earlier ages. And this has been across different cultural contexts. It's been throughout hundreds of years of history. So this is pretty universal.
So, okay. So the next question, I think for me, the next natural question is like the next big theme that I see in your work is intersectionality. And so first, can you give a definition of what is intersectionality?
Absolutely. So intersectionality is the recognition that people have multiple intersecting identities that all exist at the same time. And there are systems of power and inequality that interact with those identities and affect a person's experience based on their unique kind of mix of identities that they have. And this concept was initially developed by Black feminist scholars who were kind of critically examining the unique experiences that people with multiple marginalized identities have. So this is people like Black women, right? They've got multiple identities that have historically been marginalized. And so they aren't having some of the same experiences as, say, Black men or white women, right? So they wanted to critically examine that. In the last 30 years or so, we have disciplines like public health and epidemiology that have started considering some of these questions and incorporating statistical approaches that consider the intersection of multiple different social identities and looking at how those identities affect patterns of mortality, patterns of other health outcomes. And we're realizing it's a far bigger impact than we thought it would be. Bioarchaeology is kind of new to the game. It's really only been the last 7 to 10 years that we have started considering intersectionality, considering the intersection of multiple identities, and how this might be affecting what we're seeing in human skeletal remains. What's kind of interesting about this is I think bioarchaeology is really uniquely situated to contribute to some of these discussions about intersectionality and what it means for people's experiences and their health. We have this really extensive temporal depth that we can add to conversations, and we have a variety of different cultural contexts to say, okay, how do we produce and maintain some of these structural inequalities? And then how do we dismantle that? How do we change some of the effects, the negative effects of inequality, particularly in these people who have multiply marginalized identities? And then also we can identify some sources of resilience. You know, a lot of times when we think about health outcomes and risk of mortality, it's a lot of doom and gloom, right? It's you know, what are the 50 ways that you can die tomorrow? Like it's not very uplifting. But we can also identify, okay, how are these people resilient? How are they exhibiting behaviors and identities that can actually prolong their lives, and what can we do to encourage that?
Yeah, I think the other cool thing about archaeology / bioarchaeology is that, not to bring it back to the doom and gloom, but everyone dies.
Yeah,
everyone dies, and so that means that a lot of the times when you look at history is written by people in wealth, people with power, people who won, right? And when you look at bioarchaeology, you're looking at everyone who died that you have access to. And so it gives you like a window into the lives of people who otherwise wouldn't have a voice in history.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, like you said, the winners wrote history. They're not only determining that they're the ones who have the voice, but they're also the ones who determine what's interesting, what's worth writing about, right? It's not usually women. It's not usually children. It's not usually people of color. It's not usually the poor, right? It's usually your wealthy adult males who get all of the discussion, all of the historical studies, and the entire, 99% of the population that's not, a adult white male, gets thrown by the wayside, and they don't get a voice.
Yeah. Yeah. That being said, one thing that comes up on this podcast constantly is that, like, when you have assemblages, you're also limited to what has survived. So, like, inherently every sample has some bias in it, because it's like, not, even though all of us die, not all of us have skeletal remains sticking around for a bioarchaeologist to study. So how do you think about that when you're doing your work? How is that something that you deal with when you're doing research?
This is something that all bioarchaeologists have to contend with. If someone doesn't recognize this, we're essentially cutting ourselves off at the knees. I mean, we need to realize that there might be biases in preservation. There might be biases in terms of where we not only choose to excavate, but where we can excavate. A lot of skeletal samples, for example, in England, are excavated because they are being rescued, in a sense. So contract archaeology is this entire branch of archaeology that focuses on clearing areas that are about to be developed, or there's some construction project that's going to go through. And in a lot of those cases, because, England has been inhabited for a very long period of time, you, of course, are going to encounter cemeteries, burial grounds, archaeological sites in general. And so those need to be excavated so that they can be preserved for science and for people in general. And so a lot of the assemblages that bioarchaeologists are working with are coming from some of these contexts that they weren't chosen, right? They weren't nobody specifically said, yes, that's the cemetery I want to work with. Those are the people that I want to know more about. It's a lot of times samples of convenience and samples that are biased in some way themselves. So, for example, we work where we have access to a lot of hospital assemblages, right? Hospitals are great because if we want to learn about, health and disease, it's a good place to start. But then you have to think about who is going to a hospital, right? It's not the best of the best in the population. Everybody who's doing well, you don't go to the doctor for no reason. And so we have this kind of biased view of, who is sick in the population and what kinds of sicknesses are there and how common are some of these sicknesses. We get this overestimate in some cases of diseases in skeletal samples simply because the people who die and are included in these skeletal samples are the ones who were more frail or more sick than their peers.
Yeah. And historically in the past too, like if you died in the hospital and you didn't have enough money to get buried in your own cemetery, like they put you in with a bunch of other people, pauper's grave, whatever. They have potter's field. There's like a bunch of different terms for it. So like you do get like this super biased sample of like poor people who died at the hospital who had no one to claim them or who didn't have enough money to get buried anywhere else.
Right. And this is a historical problem in bioarchaeology in general, is this question of, a lot of the samples that we've been studying are where they're studied because they're convenient, because we have access to them, because no one has come to claim their ancestor. But what that means is we're usually looking at people who experienced the very marginalization we're trying to study. And that we're trying to give a voice to, right? We've got whole groups of people who, because they were impoverished or because they were a person of color, right? Their family may have not had the means or the access to retrieve their body and give them a proper burial. And so they end up in some of these collections. And we need to be aware of that. We need to start questioning the ethics of specifically looking at some of those collections that are composed of people who were marginalized all throughout life. And then we continue to marginalize them by not giving them a choice in participating in some of these studies now.
Yeah, there's a researcher, that Carlina Delacova, who has written pretty extensively about like some of the Smithsonian collections that basically have these issues with them. But what I wanted to talk to you about, actually, one of the things that you mentioned was that you are working in England quite a bit. I was curious about like the collections that you're working with. How did you end up there? Why?
Sure. So some of it, again, is a matter of convenience and access. So my previous work, so in my graduate studies, my advisor at the time had a long history of studying the Black Death in England. So her name is Dr. Sharon DeWitt. And she's kind of known as the Black Death bioarchaeologist, right? How do we study human skeletal remains to learn about the impact of the Black Death, not only over time, but also who was it targeting, right? Not everyone was affected equally. So because I was working with her on some of her projects, I had already been present in England before. People were familiar with me. And so it was a little bit easier to introduce some of my own research questions and my own interests and gain access to some of these skeletal samples. Another thing, aside from convenience for me personally, another thing is the access that we have to skeletal samples in England and in Europe more broadly. There is a history of respect for science, interest in what science can tell us, that we might not see in places like the United States. There's also a great collection of skeletons across a variety of institutions. There are samples at universities that I've worked with, and there are samples at museums that I've worked with, the biggest one being the Museum of London. And the Museum of London has been fantastic for bioarchaeologists because it is one of the biggest institutions that has provided scholars in bioarchaeology with a lot of access to data that we otherwise wouldn't have. They have this huge database. It's called the Wellcome Osteological Research Database. And they have collected almost everything from every individual in every skeletal sample that they have that you could possibly want to know for your bioarchaeological study. So if you have a question about some of these indicators of childhood frailty, you can use some of the data that they've already gathered and perform your own analyses and look at some of those findings and form interpretations about that period and about that location. And you don't even have to physically be there to study the remains themselves. So I think England and in London, especially, they've really facilitated this process of bioarchaeological research in ways that other portions of the world either haven't been able to or haven't tried to. Answering some of these questions that we have was particularly easy when talking about English samples.
Yeah. It gets complicated in the United States when you're dealing with native assemblages because a lot of native people do not want to be studied, which is totally fair. And
with good reason.
Yeah, right? Yeah, exactly. And we have NAGPRA, and it's like the perspective is very different. I, quote unquote, growing up academically, worked in the colonial tidewater. So it was a lot of people whose families were still around, a lot of like English settlers' families who were still around, who were like, yes, please dig up my great 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 grandma. I would love to know what you can learn about her. It's just a completely different perspective of remains and like body and like religion, and both of them are totally valid, but like it does make things just ethically much more complicated in the United States than it does in somewhere like England, where people are much more happy to have people dug up.
Absolutely. Right. I've had instances where I was in England collecting data, working with some of these skeletal samples, and someone would come to tour the museum or the university or wherever that I was working. And they would say, oh, well, the reason we're here is because, my great-great-grandfather was buried here. And so we wanted to see, what people had learned about that time period and about him specifically, or people like him. What can you tell us? It's always questions about, I want to learn more, but it's coming from, again, a place of privilege. I mean, if you and your ancestors have never been mistreated by the medical or scientific community, you don't have reason to be cautious or distrusting.
Yeah, totally.
Whereas that's definitely not true for indigenous communities, but also, people of color in the United States.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes, VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, for people who are not in Virginia. Um, I worked on an assemblage that they found at the bottom of a well from their old anatomy school that was primarily individuals of color. And the assumption is that a lot of them were individuals it was a grave robbing situation from a local black cemetery where they stole a bunch of these bodies for the medical students to practice on, and like trying to figure out what to do, how to repatriate's the wrong word in this case, but how to get those remains back in a respectful way to like where they ought to be was a major point of discussion for us.
Right. And it's disturbingly common
Super
in the United
common.
States.
Yeah. And I think when a lot of times when we talk about the United States, we talk about like Native Americans, but you're absolutely right that like other minorities also had a lot of problems, especially even in death. It's crazy. Sorry. Anyway,
Right.
I don't mean to get off on this tangent because this is like, that could be like an entire episode right there.
Unto itself.
Yes. So, okay. One of the things, so we talked about intersectionality, we talked about London and like why you have access to all of these samples, and we talked about frailty. One of the things that I was really interested to learn about is that in like the modern medical, like Western medical establishment, there's this thing called the morbidity-mortality paradox. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So the morbidity-mortality paradox is a pattern we see in living populations of lower age-specific mortality rates, lower disease-specific mortality rates, longer life expectancies in general among females compared to males. Right? So basically, females live longer than males, but they experience increased morbidity or poor health compared to their male counterparts. So some scholars have suggested that this has something to do with females being biologically more resilient somehow, or maybe having a greater capacity to buffer against diseases or against environmental disruptions compared to males. And so maybe that's why females live so much longer than males in modern settings.
Does the morbidity-mortality paradox exist in the assemblages that you study?
That's the question. So do we know that this pattern existed in the past? And if so, how far back does it go? Right? One of the things that I think often we do just in daily life is assume that our experiences can just be projected back onto the past. You know, what I experience in my day-to-day life is pretty much the same as what a woman experienced in the 1800s or what someone experienced in the 1300s, right? But we don't actually know that. We don't actually have proof of that until we go check. So one of the things that my colleagues and I did in a recent paper was ask that question, you know, how far back can we find evidence of the morbidity-mortality paradox? And specifically, we looked at some skeletal collections from medieval London. So these are all collections that are dated somewhere between about 1100 to the mid 1500s, right? Mm-hmm. And we created these different skeletal indices of frailty to try and measure and compare who was frail and who wasn't, and is there a difference in frailty between males and females, which would imply a morbidity-mortality paradox. And ultimately what we found is there wasn't a difference in the frailty of males and females. And so this is a bit concerning, right? Because this means that this paradox that we found over and over and over again in not just human studies, but animal studies, doesn't exist in medieval London. So then we have to ask ourselves, why, right? What is causing this disparity that we expect to exist to not exist in medieval London? And one of our guesses was that it was something cultural, right? Maybe it's not biological at all. Maybe it is something cultural in medieval London that is putting females at risk or is diminishing their access to some health promoting resources that they have access to in the present day. And so that's kind of evening the scales for males and females, so to speak. And so this makes sense with medieval London because we know that this is a patriarchal society. They are preferentially giving resources to males at the expense of everyone else. So this is at the expense of females. This is at the expense of children, oftentimes. And so this is sufficient, this preference for males or for men could have evened it out and could have made it so that males and females lived for similar amounts of time and had similar frailty across the life course.
So you were seeing like similar levels of disease and morbidity in both males and females, but men were just like living longer, or did males have lower levels of frailty?
So generally we were seeing similar levels of some of those health indicators that we see in skeletal remains. We were looking at a variety of different skeletal indicators, and we were trying to compile them to get together to get basically one index of how frail a person was, and then compare that number across different individuals. So overall, we were seeing that males and females had similar index scores. They had similar counts, basically, of these skeletal stress markers.
Yes. This is also a really excellent paper. It's called, I'm going to put it in the show notes too. It's called Patterns of Frailty in Non-Adults from Medieval London. One of the other things that you noted was that, interestingly, that you hypothesized that frailer individuals were dying at younger ages before skeletal lesions could manifest, while their less frail peers survived multiple physiological insults before succumbing to death at older ages. That was a quote. I wrote it down, which I thought was really interesting. Can you kind of talk about that? Because I thought it was an interesting idea that you were like, this is something that we see because not all disease affects the bone, right? I think I brought this example up on a different show recently, but syphilis, for example, you can have syphilis and not have it affect your bones.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Actually, most syphilis cases will not affect bones.
It is very impressive when it affects the bone. It's wild looking. Also,
another good thing to search on Google.
Yes, please, at your office in front of all your coworkers, please search syphilitic bones. Leave safe
that
search
on.
But like there people can die of syphilis without it affecting their bones. So it's like, I guess, like, how did you kind of come to this conclusion that like people were, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm rambling now. I'm like over explaining the question to you.
No, absolutely. So this is one of the pieces of something known as the osteological paradox. Have you discussed that before?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So the osteological paradox is this conceptual but also practical paper that was published in 1992, and it has just been causing waves ever since. And one of the things that the authors suggested in this paper was that we are misinterpreting some of the patterns of skeletal lesions that we observe in human skeletal remains. So typically, if you saw two bones, right, from two individuals, and one bone is just covered with bumps and bruises and markers of disease, and one bone is completely clear of disease or markers of disease. The first bone, it's just kind of your gut instinct to think, oh, that person was unhealthy, right? That they must have been real sick to have all of those markers on their bone. And then the second person must have been super healthy because they have no indicators whatsoever of poor experiences or illnesses or disease. But what the authors of this particular study suggested is that because skeletal lesions take time to form, anybody who has a skeletal lesion had to survive at least for a little while, right? So maybe these people with all these lesions on them were actually the kind of healthy people. They were the less frail people. And the people who have completely perfect, clean bones are actually the worst off. They are the frailest of the frail because they died before they could even form a lesion. They just died so quickly, they have nothing at all. Um, so this idea is kind of thrown bioarchaeology for a loop because every time we see patterns of skeletal indicators, are these individuals who were unhealthy because we see a lot of skeletal indicators, or were they actually people who were pretty resilient, pretty well off? Um, so when we look at some of these confusing patterns in some of the studies that we produce, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is it kind of the exact opposite of what I would typically interpret? So if I see, like I did in that particular sample, a group of adults that have a lot of skeletal indicators that suggest troubled childhoods, right? Maybe those people were the survivors, and other people that I'm not looking at, people who died at very, very young ages, didn't have some of those skeletal indicators and they were the frail individuals. So maybe seeing these patterns of increased frailty or markers of poor health is actually a good thing. Right?
Yeah. It's so interesting.
It can be frustrating. It's interesting because it always provides good fodder for thinking about what am I actually observing? What is the pattern that could produce this? But it can also be frustrating because, every time you come up with something, it could be the exact opposite.
Yeah. Science is fun, kids. You should do it.
It is. Definitely join the field.
So you also had just like a variety of papers that kind of looked at like intersectionality and mortality in medieval London and in like industrializing London as well. I strongly recommend people read them. I'll link all of them in the show notes. But I was actually also wondering, is there a particular individual that you have looked at that has really stuck with you? I ask this because I was talking to an anthropologist recently, and we started reminiscing about like really interesting skeletons that like they just like really stick in your mind, and like you just, I don't know. So have you had someone like that in your collections?
Yes. So I wouldn't be able to tell you, what their specific, ID was or anything about them as a person. But there was a time when I was working in London with some of the collections from the Museum of London. And I was thinking about, what are the ways that people died? What are some of the main hazards that people were exposed to in the medieval period in a city like London? And I came across this individual who had a ridiculous fracture across their femur. And just to provide a little bit of background, the femur is the longest and in many ways the strongest bone in your body. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to break a femur. It can be useful in modern contexts in the sense that if you come into the emergency room with a broken femur, the doctor already knows some information about what caused that break because you would have had to have been moving at pretty high speeds, right, to be able to put sufficient force behind your femur to break it.
A lot of those breaks are torsional, which means that there's like a rotation component to why it broke. Femurs are gnarly to break.
Right. Really, really difficult. So seeing this in a historical collection, dated to the medieval period, I'm just like, okay, they weren't skateboarding. They weren't in a car accident. What causes that type of break? And I was talking with one of my colleagues about this, and she said, oh, car accident. Just like people get hit by cars today, there would be these freak cart accidents where, the horses get spooked and they run off and they're dragging the cart and they're moving at a ridiculously high speed and somebody just gets caught up in it. and gets hit by a cart. In a lot of cases, these individuals die. I mean, you don't have the medical professionals that you have today. You don't have the medical knowledge that you have today. So a lot of times they would
You
just
don't
try
have
and
bagged blood.
they don't have bagged blood. So,
Like,
if you've nicked your femoral artery, you're gone.
you're
Like
done.
you're done.
Yeah.
So most people who had a break that bad, who were probably that injured and probably had pretty extensive soft tissue injuries as well, they didn't survive. But this person, it was healed. It wasn't healed well. So this was somebody who may not have had money to get their fracture reset properly, or maybe they did have it reset, but they had to go back to work, right? Maybe they were an agricultural laborer or something, which was incredibly common in the medieval period. They had to go back to work, or they have no income, they have no source of food. And so they put weight on it too early. That causes the fracture to misalign. And now all of a sudden, they've got this healed fracture that was improperly set and misaligned. And it was just kind of interesting to think about how someone gets to that point, right? What sort of things do they have to be exposed to have a break that bad and then not have it properly set, but to still survive. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. It also makes you think about, like, to some extent, they must have had some support.
Right.
Too.
Yeah.
Right?
There have been tons of really great studies of disability in bioarchaeology, where we find these people with what would only be described as debilitating conditions. This person probably couldn't walk, and if they could walk, it was probably difficult or painful. And the only way that person can continue surviving is if someone is supporting them. And humans are incredibly reliant on our social communities. We can't give birth unassisted. We typically need help to survive these kinds of injuries. So thinking about injuries like that, of course, immediately leads you to what kinds of social support did this person have that they were able to survive something so disruptive and so dangerous at that time.
Yeah. I think there's something amazing about skeletons. Like, when you are face to face with that individual and you're like, it just, sometimes some of them really have the power to, like, take you back with them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for sharing that. I'm going to wrap up with our normal questions. But however, since it does appear that you do field work, I have an added question for you, which is, what is one thing that you take with you into the field that is probably not on anyone's, like, normal quote unquote packing list? I don't know, like, someone once told me that they bring their own pillow into the field because they, like, cannot stand the pillows that they have for them.
So I have a pretty cushy field research experience. I mean, it's usually I'm working in museums or universities, and I'm usually staying in Airbnbs or something similar. So I usually have a comfortable bed to sleep in. I usually have a roof over my head, so I'm not sleeping in a tent or something like that. But one of the things that I think people overlook in bioarchaeology is hand lotion, and just how vital hand lotion is. It sounds ridiculous. It really does. So if you think about, like, what a bioarchaeologist is doing, over the course of a 9 to 5 workday, they are grabbing a box, usually out of some dark, dusty hallway somewhere, wherever it's stored. We're grabbing this box. It's covered in dust. We open the box. We pull out someone's skeletal remains that are coming from archaeological contexts. So the bones are covered in dirt. And then we examine what we need to. We put the individual away, we put the box up, we grab another box. So you're doing this over and over and over again. And you're constantly being exposed to dust and dirt. And it just dries out your hands and makes them so chapped and painful so incredibly quickly. And it's just not something that I thought to take with me when I was first a grad student. And I had to go out to whatever I was lucky because I was in London. There are plenty of stores where I can go buy hand lotion. But it's not something I thought about as being necessary. And now I have usually multiple bottles of lotion. You know, there's one in my larger bag, there's one in my purse where I keep my laptop and any of the equipment that I need, just to make sure that I
Yeah.
don't have to deal with the horrible chapped hand
No, it's totally fair. And like you're washing your hands all the time.
all the time.
Yeah. That's really funny. I had never thought of that. That is very true. I think like when I was in like my prime bioarchaeology years, I was also working outside to make money. So I was working at a horse farm. So I was slathering myself in lotion constantly because I was outside all the time. So that never happened to me because I was just like literally head to toe because it gets so cold in Virginia in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's incredible. I love that. Can I ask you if someone wants to learn more about the research that you're doing, whether that's like bioarchaeology in general or your work in particular, where is a good place for them to start?
Certainly. So for bioarchaeology in general, there have been a series of great books and textbooks and edited volumes on the theories and concepts and approaches that we incorporate into our work. A good place to start, I think, would be Bioarchaeology: An Integrated Approach to Working with Human Remains. This is by Deborah Martin, Ryan Herod, and Ventura Perez. If you're more interested in kind of less of a general approach and something more focused on integrating social theory into bioarchaeology, Sabrina Agarwal and Bonnie Glencross edited a fantastic volume called Social Bioarchaeology that really talks about the different ways that we can actually incorporate theories and perspectives like intersectionality into our work. Other good ones for bioarchaeology and paleopathology in general are things like Companion to Paleopathology, that's edited by Anne Grauer. And of course, Ortner's Identification of Pathological Conditions in Human Skeletal Remains, most recently edited by Jane Dykstra. So those are really good kind of general texts that I would suggest. If you want to dive into some of the more specific concepts or perspectives that I employ, things like the developmental origins hypothesis, there have been a few good journal articles that have kind of summarized the work in the field up to this point. So Rebecca Gowland had a journal article in 2015 called Entangled Lives: The Implications of the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease Hypothesis for Bioarchaeology and the Life Course. Dan Temple also wrote a really nice review of developmental origins approaches called Bioarchaeological Evidence for Adaptive Plasticity and Constraint, Exploring Life History Trade-offs in the Human Past. They both do a fantastic job, better than I could do, certainly, of reviewing bioarchaeological approaches to developmental origins. In terms of intersectionality, since this is relatively new, there have really only been a couple reviews of it in bioarchaeology. So one of them was by Sharon DeWitt and myself. It's a book chapter in Theoretical Approaches in Bioarchaeology, which was edited by Cheverico, Prince Butenhuis, and Hube. And then there's another one that I wrote recently. This was actually a journal article in Bioarchaeology International. It's called Intersectionality and the Interpretation of Past Pandemics.
That was really good. It was really good.
I hope it gives a decent view of not only, you know, where is intersectionality coming from, how can we incorporate it into bioarchaeology, but then what are some of the methodological questions we need to be asking? You know, some of this isn't just theoretical, but how do we operationalize it? How do we get it into bioarchaeological studies in a meaningful way? And hopefully that comes across in that article.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I actually have it bookmarked, and I'm going to include it in the show notes, obviously. Super good. What are you reading for work right now?
So a few different things. In terms of books, I am teaching a class this semester on research methods in biological anthropology and, the pursuit of science, basically. And one of the topics we're going to be talking about is about fraud and bias in science and how it just seeps in to what we do, and we have to be aware of it at all times. And so one of my colleagues actually suggested this book by Stuart Ritchie. It's called Science Fictions, and it is a really good starting point for questions about how does bias enter into our research? How can we try and avoid or eliminate bias? What are some of the biggest problems for science in terms of, publication bias? And what are we not seeing in scientific publications because of how we choose to work? So that's one of the things I'm reading. I'm also reading a couple journal articles from colleagues who are working in some of the same areas that I am. So I'm reading or rereading a couple of those. One of them is by God and colleagues from 2020. It's a survival analysis of the Black Death. And she includes some new approaches, particularly new statistical approaches to how we can look at survivorship in the past. And then another one that I was looking at was McCool and colleagues, which was an article in 2021 that looked at how we can answer some of these troubling questions about the osteological paradox. If we realize that there are biases in our samples, how do we deal with that? How do we overcome some of these biases so that we can still say something meaningful about the past?
Those are all really, really good answers. I feel like you've given people a good semester's worth of homework.
I apologize in advance. You probably have other things you'd like to be reading, and now you're stuck with this reading list from me.
No, I think it's excellent because people do write to me like fairly frequently, and they're like, "What book should I read to get started?" I'm like, "Check out the website. It's got all of the books, all of the recommendations that anyone has ever given me is on the website." And I'll also obviously put them in the show notes as well. Last question is, what are you consuming for fun right now?
So many things. So I am a big fan of fantasy. That's my number one thing that I'm usually reading. I just finished a book called The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon.
That's really on my to-read list.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's long. It's pretty thick and heavy to get through, but it's one of those great books that kind of challenges these ideas of where do we get our conceptions of people from? What kinds of stereotypes are we using to inform our interactions with people, and how can they go horribly awry? Just finished that. It was great. The next one on my reading list is Children of Blood and Bone. It's by Tomi Adeyemi. This particularly caught my eye because so often fantasy novels, especially even high fantasy novels that are completely new worlds, they're always based in like Roman or Greek mythology, right? White people mythology. And it's limiting. I mean, it's really limiting some of the stories we can tell and the comments we can make. And this was the first text I could find, and I'm digging for more, that stems from West African mythology and makes a lot of really great comments on oppression and racism and slavery using some of these fictional characters and fictional contexts.
That sounds so good. And I think that's exactly what I need after the last book that I read, which was, it was bad. It was not a good book. I feel bad saying that because like someone put their like blood, sweat, and tears into this, and I know
Right.
how hard writers work because I'm an editor. Like, I have worked with writers my entire career. Not a book editor, but still. But it was called the Pumpkin Spice Cafe, and I mean, like, I should have been tipped off by the title. but I started it because my best friend went into labor, and we just needed something like not serious to read. And so like I went online and I just like picked the first book talk book that I found. But I'm a completionist.
Talk can lead you astray.
I'm a completionist. And so I finished it and it was not worth it.
Oh, you trudged through it.
I did.
There have been very, very few cases where I've decided not to finish a book. So I completely understand the decision, the choice that you have to make where do I just not finish this book? Can I just let it go unfinished?
Yeah. Well, so she was in labor for a while. So I read her like probably like 4 or 5 chapters aloud. So I was like far enough in that I was like, yeah, fine. Because it's not a long book. Point. It's not a long book either. Like it wasn't, but like the entire time I was reading it, I was mad.
I'm still stuck here reading this.
And then the last nonfiction book that I finished was actually Period by Kate Clancy, which is about menstrual cycles, and I'm really excited because I'm going to have her on the show. So,
oh, nice.
Yeah. But I wanted to put in like a good book recommendation too, and not just a.
Please do. Yeah, no, you can send me all of your garbage books. That's what I really want to consume.
I have like a huge list of garbage books. I'm so happy to send them to you.
Send it to me after the show.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
And I hope you have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show was produced and edited by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.